Welcome. Fuente Meerapfel presents Meet the Professor. Hello, everybody.
¿Qué pasa, Papo?
Dímelo, Papo, el profesor. Hello, everyone.
What's up, everybody?
How you doing?
How's people out there in cigar world?
Oh, man.
All good, all good, all good.
Thank God. That's great news.
We're great to see a lot of people here today. We're glad to have the family around the table and another great session with the professor. Professor, what's cooking today?
You know, because I'm supposed to be a professor, I've been researching a lot. And today it's a theme that I think it's going to bring, Carlito's going to have to help out with this because he's more a professor on this theme today than I am. So Carlito, I decided today to talk about two things, a little bit about Cuba, but talk a lot about Ybor City. Because I think, and this was a conversation I've had with Benji, and you know it because you and I have talked about it, and Jeremiah knows about it. You know, in the peak years of Cuba, people thought the Cubans were doing 80, 100, 200 million cigars. And I tell people, no, that is not true. In the late 55, 56, 58, even Benji told me that at a max, they were doing 35 million cigars. And at that time, Ybor City alone was doing close to 400 million. And there was a time where the country almost did 3 billion cigars. So Carlito, if there's somebody that really knows a lot about the history of Ybor City, and I know, and I learned it the other day, there was Vicente Martinez Ybor, and it was basically Cubans and Spaniards that, how do you say, poblado, they, you know, they came.
They were the residents, yes.
Yeah, they were resident there. So it was like, and I'm not bringing it up, you know, against anybody. It's just that it's all about history. And, you know, we talk about history and how things were. And what a lot of people don't realize that mostly all the tobacco was Cuban tobacco at that time. I was even looking at numbers from the 50s and 51, 52, where you could know the amount of tobacco that was produced in Cuba at the time and exported to Spain, some to Germany, but it was basically to the States. So I don't know the wrappers that were using at that time, and I'm gonna get a little bit of history today from El Papo del Humo. So what's up, Carlito?
No, I'm doing well. No, thank you for bringing up my, wow, this is gonna be a tough one for me because it brings back so many warm memories. And I was born in Ybor City. And I was born in Ybor City, 1954. And it was a community where everyone either were cigar makers, they owned cigar factories, they worked in a box company that made boxes for the cigar companies. They were the barbers who cut the hair of the cigar makers, or they were the butchers who cut the meat for the cigar makers, or they were the veterinarians who took care of the fighting roosters for the cigar makers. Or they sold bolita, which was in those days was gambling or numbers that came from Havana.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, you know, but the point of trying to make that it was a community that, you know, is very special. It's one of those lost cities, lost communities that I don't think it's possible to ever relive again. I remember, I mean, you're talking about Ybor City. It's a community in Tampa, Florida. An ethnic community that was built, as you said, by Martinez Vicente Ybor during the Spanish-American War, right after the Spanish-American War. And, you know, there was nothing there. Tampa was swamps. It was nothing but swamps. And the cigar industry, it's really what built Tampa, and it became known as the fine cigar capital of the world. But before Tampa, there was Key West. Key West, 90 miles from Havana. Key West, there was a big industry there, big cigar industry. Of course, the cigar industry was also, it was the biggest industry in Key West. And Key West at one time, during the when Spain still owned Cuba, when it was still Spanish territory, because I go to Key West a lot and been to the museums, and the history fascinates me because my heritage comes from Key West, from Havana to Key West to Ybor City. And at one time, Key West was the most industrial city south of Atlanta. And for people to conceive that today, it's almost impossible. But cigar making was the biggest industry, with the exception of shipwrecking. Key West is completely surrounded by reefs and so forth. And in those days, there were wooden ferries. And those ferries used to take the tobacco to Key West and everything for the factories, and also bring the cigar makers back and forth. I mean, literally 90 miles is nothing from the port of Havana. But a lot of times those ferries, they ran into the coral reefs. And actually shipwrecking was Key West's largest industry. And if you go to Key West as a tourist, you will see they have a lot of museums and things that dedicated to pirates and so forth, because there was an island that was like, it was a world of its own. But what happened was that there was Martinez Vicente will move to Tampa because there was there was a competition, or there was a need to get the cigars all the way from Key West up to the big markets in the Northeast and Chicago. And it was always done by boat. It was always done by ferry and so forth. And there's a lot of trouble because Key West is not a natural port. And there was a competition to bring down the railroad. That's when Flagler started building the railroad all the way down to Key West. But Tampa is a natural port. And, the port of Tampa Bay, famous shipbuilding and natural port, no coral reefs. It was just ideal. It's on the Gulf of Mexico. And if you look at Havana, it's on the Gulf of Mexico. You don't have to go all across the island against the currents. And there's a man by the name of Plant, Henry Plant. He finished the railroad to Tampa before the railroad to Key West was finished. And suddenly, the industry from Key West was having a lot of problems during the Spanish-American War. There was a big fire and so forth, because all the money for the revolution of the independence of Cuba, a lot of it came from cigar makers who would weekly donate money for the revolution, for their independence in Cuba. But all of a sudden, all that industry, which was having so much difficulty, Key West moved to Tampa. Martinez Vicente started in Tampa. Tampa was nothing but swamps. It was a fort, just a fort there, an American fort. And started building these little wooden homes, shotgun homes, they call them, like the ones in Ybor City, and would bring cigar makers, and they will let them to slowly pay for their homes. I mean, very, very low payments, less than rent practically, and gave them tobacco, gave them an opportunity, to the taste of freedom and the American dream and so forth. And there was another man by Sanchez Aya and Salvador Rodriguez, and these built 3 basic communities around the Ybor City area with this plans of getting people homes and so forth. So Tampa boomed. And when I say Tampa, it was Ybor City. Tampa. Ybor City was it was famous world, around all the United States and everything. And, it's true what you say, that all the factories, all they used was Havana tobacco. Of course, some of the factories that were making more of the most popular cigars may have used tobaccos from the States or other tobaccos to blend, but not tobaccos from Nicaragua, Honduras, or the Dominican Republic as we know today. That didn't come into play into the 60s. So before that, tobacco was all Havana, Connecticut, basically Havana filler and Havana wrappers. But a lot of people are not aware the most popular wrapper in the 50s and the 60s from Cuba in the US market was Candela wrapper or fire cured wrapper or the green wrapper. That was the most popular wrapper. It wasn't the dark, the Maduros and so forth in the United States. So, but there was a lot of factories there. And more than the cigar making, Ybor City was an amazing community. It was a community where everyone knew each other, where I remember sitting and I was a little boy and, I had my little tricycle, whatever. There were sidewalks everywhere. was one of those communities built, you know, like an old European city, and where everything commuted through sidewalks, you know, things that you don't see today in a lot of developed communities. But sidewalks are very important because people commuted back and forth, and every home had a porch in the front, and they all had rocking chairs. And it was a way of life where your neighbors would come over and they would smoke a cigar, because everyone smoked cigars. I literally remember where on 1614 13th Street, where I was born, and my father was born also, with a little house that the cigar factory was in the back. Right behind us was a big cigar factory, which was nicknamed La Pila, because everything had a nickname in those days. In the corner was a factory that Benjamin Menendez spoke a lot about. And he spoke a lot about in his interview. And no, I'm sorry, a phone call was coming in. I just cut it off. It was Sanchez Anaya, which was Gold Label, which was Gradius Annis later on. And that's where he met a lot of the people that he was referring to and everything. And that was just right down the street. The nickname of that factory was King B. So there was a lot of naming. And there was a bar, cafe, who used to support the cigar makers. And I used to go with my grandfather as a little boy. And, you know, he used to walk me in. I might have been 3 years old. I wasn't supposed to go there because they served alcohol. My grandfather's excuse, they was to deliver a couple of boxes of cigars and collect. But I used to remember waiting in the door and the people playing dominoes and all, you know, drinking. He'd go to the bar, you know, sell this box of cigar, have a couple of drinks, and then you walk me back basically just catty corner across the street. And sorry again, man. They got someone keep trying to want to call me. I don't know how to. Melanie, you got to teach me how to do that, how to block calls. That's going to be job one next week. But I remember going to King B and things like, I'm 3 years old and my grandmother yelling, Arturo, Arturo, and everything. And my grandfather said, hey, don't say you came with me. Don't say you were with me, this and that. He used to bring me into the back and everything. And I would tell my grandmother I was just in the back playing with the chickens. But it was that kind of life and that kind of community that everybody, you know, someone caught a cold or had a fever, the entire neighborhood would bring in soup, food. It was such a caring thing. And you know, growing up in the cigar factory, you know, I've said this so many times, but it's so unusual. And I accredit that to the community, that it was part of our lives, part of my life, and everybody that is my age that remembers some, and people older than me, because I caught the last stand in the 50s and 60s. But you know, I used to sit on cigar makers' laps when I was 1 year old, 10 months old, 11 months old. I used to play under the cigar maker's table, crawling around and everything with my cousin Arturo. And we were just 9 months apart. We used to crawl on the bottom. Nobody back then thought about, you know, any kind of dust, tobacco dust or bacteria or germs or anything. And I don't remember ever getting sick, but I used to sit in a cigar maker's lab while they were smoking a cigar. And one thing that I want to mention is that, to me, that's very important about the community before we talk about other things as far as cigars, is that I was never taught by my grandparents, by my parents. I was never taught which cigar maker whose lap I sat on, whether it was a female or male, or in the banging department I used to sit with, because I lived in that house. Remember, my grandfather's house was in the front part of the factory. I actually lived there and I slept there. So I was all day playing with the cigar makers and watching them and entertained by them. And what's amazing is that I never remember once my grandmother telling me, Nana, for example, because everybody had a nickname. And Nana she's a good friend of mine and everything. And we've known her for many years. I used to call her Aunt Nana. She was my aunt. Everybody there was my aunt, my uncle, and everything. They never distinguished or told me or taught me which was my godfather, my godmother, which was a neighbor, or which was an employee who my grandfather knew for a long time. We were all family. And that is something that, you know, it's so dear to my heart that I think that's something that I really strive for today. In any way I can. It's a different world. We all know it's a different world. Things are a lot more It's not as simple as those days, and life has changed, but I hold those memories and I hold those lessons very dear to my heart. And Ybor City was one of a kind. There was no place like it in the world. You had the Cubans, the Spaniards, and a lot of Sicilians, a lot of Italians. Those that watch those movies nowadays, you heard some of the names I don't want to mention. They're from Tampa. The casinos in Havana were run out of Tampa. The assassination of President Kennedy, all the Senate hearings, there were people from Tampa. Because Ybor City was all the time of prohibition. It had the railroad that came right through Ybor City. All those buildings or those restaurants that we know today that are our favorite, they have tunnels. They find all these tunnels in Ybor City. And of course, it was because of the bootlegging and the prohibition with the rum that came from Havana. So there is so much, some people, they write movies about these things, it's not romantic, but it's romanticism, it's mystique, the bootlegging, the cigars. One thing about Tampa, Ybor City, they have social clubs. If you look at those social clubs, they look like monuments. I mean, these are big, big clubs. Look in the internet, look them up. Look for Centro Asturiano, Centro Español, El Círculo Cubano, the Cuban Club, La Unión Italiana. These are clubs that look like those beautiful old-time banks in Chicago with big columns in the entrance and all marble floors and 4 floors where on the bottom was a cantina where they played the games, and then they had upstairs was the big ballroom where they had the dances for the community. And one thing that Tampa had, which I think is very important, when I say Tampa, I mean Ybor City. It was the first place in the United States where it had social medicine. All these clubs had doctors. And if you were a cigar maker, you were a member of the club, you paid whatever it was, $1 a month or whatever it is. You had access to all the doctors and all the medicine. And this is the way I was born. This is the way Cynthia was born. This is the way my cousin Arturo was born and all the family. There was social medicine in Tampa that came from Cuba in the old days, way before a lot of these things. We all had access to medicine. It was an amazing community. It really was in many ways.
That sounds amazing.
That is, and I wanted to bring it up because, first of all, I know it's very dear to your heart, to Don Carlos, to Don Arturo, your grandfather, all your family. And, I think it'd be nice for people to hear that side. Because like I said before, it's, it was the capital of cigars. And I mean, and everything up till from what I've read and people I've talked to, everything up till 1920 was handmade. Then in the 20s, some of the companies that were doing a little bit better started to bring in the machines. But still, for many years, the rolling kept on and going and going and going. Right, Carlito?
Everything was exactly the same. I remember these companies came from Cuba. All the major companies in Tampa, Ferrari, Budisca, well, all of them, they all had offices in Havana and all had their growers in Cuba. And all the tobacco was processed by the same people and brought into ferries to Tampa. If you look at old Ybor City, some of the buildings that weren't destroyed that are left, that are historical buildings, you see above on the ceiling, above the 4th floor, you see they have like a little, it's like a little room that comes out of the ceiling, which is, they're normally about, maybe 6 feet by 6 or 6 by 7, small little rooms. And if you go up there in Ybor City, they're all facing the port of Tampa. Back in the 20s and the 30s, the foremen or the supervisors used to know when the ferries were coming in with the tobacco and the cigar makers that would arrive from Cuba. And they used to go up there, and that's how they would notice when they were arriving, so they could wait for them in the ports. But, there's just so many things and so much history and so many things that are unique from Tampa. The Spanish-American War, Teddy Roosevelt, the Rough Riders. I mean, they were in Tampa. They lived in Tampa. Teddy Roosevelt was there, and they say that the order to invade, the order from Jose Marti, who was a liberator, who's recognized as the George Washington of Tampa, came out of Tampa. It was a notice that was put inside a cigar. It was secret inside a cigar out of Tampa. Jose Marti lived in Tampa. He lived in Ybor City, and there was a lot. They used to raise money. That's where they raised money. I have photos here all through the factory because it's part of my heritage. And you see Jose Marti in Tampa in front of the buildings, in front of the Cuban Club, where he used to make speeches and talk about liberty and so forth, and ask for support of the revolution. Listen, the stories are endless. To give you an idea, my grandmother was born in Tampa, and her younger sister was born in Cuba. Because the families went on the weekends, they used to go to Havana, they used to go to Cuba, they spent 5 days there, 6 days, and they come back. They were not only ferries back and forth, later on they were, but in my time, I remember the flights, everybody waiting for my grandfather and grandmother to see the gifts they were bringing back. But my grandmother passed away when she was 72 years old, and she never spoke a word of English. Now, could you imagine being born in the United States of America and not having to speak a word of English? My grandfather arrived in the ferry from Havana at the age of 15 to Key West to make cigars in the Gato factory because his families were struggling during the independence and they were peasants. They were tobacco growers, but there was no market, there was no brand. They were just trying to make cigars for the local market, sell to the soldiers or whatever, or trade. It wasn't probably even selling. It was trading for food. So there was a big boom in Key West. My grandfather, at the age of 15, without nothing, went on a ferry to Key West to earn a few dollars a month so he could send back to his struggling family in Cuba. And from there, he got a taste of the American dream and moved to Tampa. But there is so much history. And if you see Tampa, there are so many books to read. There's one that you must read in Cuban in Americas. And it talks about that era where Tampa made almost 500 million cigars. If you think about it, that's more than Nicaragua, Honduras, the Dominican Republic, Cuba, Jamaica, Mexico export to the world today. And that was to the United States. I mean, that was one factory. I'm sorry. I mean, that was one town. That was one town. That was Ybor City or Tampa. There was also Pennsylvania. There was Cleveland. There was, all the cities. I mean, there were factories all over. There were factories in Key West still. There were factories in Jacksonville and Ocala. Ocala, there's a place that's known as Marti City, Jose Marti City. So you could imagine the amount of cigars that were consumed because that was before cigarettes. And I don't really know the history. I'm sure people who are in the audience now listening do because I was never taught, and cigarettes to me, it's a totally different animal. I really don't know. But before the war, it was all cigars. And I think that part of the machines coming into the industry also, from what I was told, and I'm only basing this on memories of maybe 50-something years, Professor, so I don't know how accurate it is, but I heard that one of the reasons that the machines came in to help with the cigar making, not to make them completely, but partially on machine and partially finished by hand, and also by machine completely, was because all the men had gone off to war. And they were mostly women then at the factory, because at one time it was mostly men. If you look at the old pictures, almost all the cigar makers were men. And after the war, during the war, they were all sent off to war, and then a lot of women started making cigars, and they brought the machines in and so forth. But still, you walk down the streets of Ybor City today, and you smell tobacco, you smell Cuban coffee, and you get the feeling when you walk down the old streets, and you see a lot of small little brick and mortar families. A lot of them are not, most of them are not Tampa families, or most of them are people who have migrated from Cuba in the last 20, 25 years, or they migrated from Nicaragua, Honduras, and learned to trade in cigars. But you see a lot of little factories and a lot of people who just, people just love to walk by, smell the tobacco, see how they're making cigars live there. And, and the food in Ybor City there's nothing like it in the world. It's still, there's still a little bit of that culture, but as far as big factories, factories are left, they're all gone with the exception of one, the J.C. Newman factory, the Newman family who have poured their hearts and soul into Tampa. And right now they're building a museum there for people to come and see the history and so forth. They're in one of the most famous buildings, historical buildings of the old world that has a huge clock tower that is a symbol of Tampa. And we're being honored because they're going to be our guests this Friday. And so we'll be able to ask them a lot of questions for when they came to Tampa, because they came from Cleveland, I believe in 1954, the year I was born. But I mean, if you ask the questions, I mean, listen, when Benjamin was on, I just kept thinking to myself, all these stories, you could write a book on the little stories of incidents and pranks that would take place within the factory. I mean, this was a way of life. I mean, that's why maybe it's part of my personality, but pranks. I remember one day, we say case the tobacco is that humidity. We used to do it in the the sherry barrels, the barriles, the barrels, fill it with water. And it used to get really hot in Tampa. Remember, no air conditioning or anything like that. It was very humid and so forth. So when the weather was good, my grandfather had all these mango trees outside the factory. And I remember the man's name was Victor. And he didn't speak a word of English or nothing. And he's out there wetting the tobacco, this and that. And my grandfather had lime trees. So my cousin, Fausto Suarez, I hope someday he hears this, he was a prankster, man. He was, there were a bunch of them. If I would have mentioned the name Armando Garcia to Benji, it would have brought tears out of his eyes. I know that one of the names you remember out of Tampa. But my cousin Fausto decides to play a joke on this man. And he's out there wetting tobacco. And he goes to the second floor and he starts throwing limes. And he hit him in the head. And the man, he got screaming, upset and everything. He wasn't injured really, nothing, but it was just a prank. But he went to my father and nobody confessed who it was. In those days, you don't talk. You don't talk. I mean, you don't confess. Whatever you know, we were taught the old days, speak quietly and don't say anything because your neighbors are listening. And in those days, if you talk, you disappear. But it was just the way we were taught, and I'm just joking, in many ways. But still today, I have to laugh because something happened within 3 weeks. The man passed away. The man passed away. And I was 8, 9 years old. I mean, I was shitting in my pants. He passed away. And my cousin told me, who's much older than me, he's Oye, Carlito. I think, because I was sitting next to him, I was next to him from the second floor watching. And I was laughing and trying to, he said, keep quiet. I'm sure it had nothing to do with the line hitting him. But my cousin told me for years, Oye, we killed him. But pranks like that, I remember one of the supervisors checking cigars on the table. His nickname was Rompe Techo, roof breaker, Rompe Techo, because he was always yelling in there. He was getting upset about everything. Any cigar wasn't perfect. He started yelling, he's having a nervous breakdown, this and that. But he was a pack of nerves and a real personality. I remember one day, Armando Garcia, very well known in Tampa, very well known, along with Emilio Seijas and all that Benji spoke so much about. This man, Rompetecho, his name was Ramon Gonzalo. He was very, very close to my grandfather. I mean, he was my grandfather's closest friend. When my grandfather passed, he told when he was passed on, my grandfather would never leave my father alone. I swear to you, he was with my father to his last day when he got a pneumonia and everything. And just to show you the kind of people, he was a man who was very humble. My father owned the factory. He didn't have kids, and his wife, Victoria, I'm talking about back in the 60s. I mean, I don't remember where I left my cell phone this morning, but I remember those days because they were so embedded in my heart. I remember this man passes away and everything. He was very close to the family. He used to dress like Santa Claus and everything. You know, everybody, all the employees used to go to my father's house, all of them on Christmas Eve. Nochebuena was a big thing for us, or Christmas Eve. And this man passes away and everything. And I remember these stories. You know, a month later, his wife comes to my father with his bank account and a letter. This man left every penny he had saved, which was practically, I had no idea, but it couldn't be much. He left it to my dad. And my dad told his wife, no, I couldn't take this. You know, you don't have son, you know, you're gonna need it. And my father took care of his wife until she passed away. Like another lady, Mary Harvey, her husband was our first salesman in New York. My father promised him he'd take care of her for as long as she was living. And we used to joke about it because Mr. Harvey passed away at 78. She must have been 75. She lived to be 100. So, but, you know, we used to joke about it. He said, man, my father said, I didn't know she was going to live that long. But, I mean, this is the way the relationship with people, they were family, people who were employees. And, you know, the pranks and everything, the way of life, it was just a different world.
Unbelievable. Carlito, I want you to clarify something. I know a little bit about it. You know, in the old days, the boxes used to be called Habana Claro, Maduro, and Oscuro. Today, we talk about Oscuro, and people don't understand it's totally different from Maduro. But the concept of Habana Claro, a lot of people have inboxed me and said, we want to hear what Carlito has to say, because he heard it from Don Arturo, and he heard it from Don Carlos a lot. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Habano Claro, I think it's more a factory term. Habano Claro, it's more of a factory term. It's a lot of terms that we use in tobacco and sorting. And I think what I remember, as far back as I can remember, was EMS Claro, EMS, English Market Selection Claro, which I think is basically Habano Claro. It was more of a lighter shade of tobacco than the darker ones. When I say dark, I'm not talking about Maduro. I'm talking about just dark natural. And there was a market, a special market for the lighter leaves, because it was Cuban tobacco. Cuban tobacco, and combustion is very important. And those higher primings in Cuban tobacco weren't known to burn that well. So there was always a second and third priming and everything. The lighter leaves that were used were the high grade Havana tobacco for the combustion and so forth. And I think I've always heard of Habano Claro inside the factory. When I was in Ybor City, I've heard the term, but I never remember in my memory seeing a box stamped with the word Habano Claro. I have seen it EMS Claro, EMS Selection, English Market Selection, Claro, Oscuro, Maduro in the later days. I don't know when Maduro came in, but when I was already in the 60s, you know, working in the packing room and stuff like that, helping my grandmother and all that, I remember Maduro, Oscuro, Colorado Oscuro. Colorado was another term that was used for grading wrappers, because in the old days, the wrappers were all basically the wrappers, with the exception of Claro Candela. A lot of times they were the same seed and from the same origin. So the wrapper selector would grade them, and then grade them by color. Then according to the color where it fell, where it's segregated, where they identify the color, then that's the way the box would be stamped. So they know if it's a lighter shade, medium shade, darker shade, Colorado Oscuro, or so forth, or, you know, or Claro. But I don't, you know, I think in those days, as far as that I could remember, I think there was basically Havana tobaccos. I don't remember in our factory, for example, I don't remember using Connecticut or Cameroon into the later days. I remember first, I think Cameroon we used for 858, and we used for a few of our handmade, you know, our more exclusive cigars. But I remember more using Mexican tobacco back in when I was working in the factory learning as an apprentice, because, you know, I hope that Ben Hamid is listening now, because when he talks about, you know, going to mechanical school and everything, that the machine's going to be the future in Tampa, you know, I'm old school too. I didn't learn as much as Ben Hamid, and I never want to compare myself to him. But I remember, you know, with a big push broom sweeping the picadura on the floor, and, you know, having the 7 years old, having the job of getting, you know, the lata, you know, the can, and filling the hoppers with picadura, and the picadura machines. They were all tobacco, but they were picadura, the curly heads. And we used to use jicotea as binder, so we get more wraps on the picadura and everything. Well, anyway, and I talk about it in the long filler machines. And I remember when I was already a teenager, I had to learn the machines, but I hated. I mean, honestly, I hated that. You know, I used to come from school. I used to lift weights, go to the gym, and blah, blah, this and that. And the machine, I remember I had to grease the machines. I remember I'll take every one of those grease little knobs there, putting the little pump in there, pumping everything. And when I was walking in the factory and everything, I used to be checking cigars, and helping bringing the wrappers and all that. I used to hear plop, and I go, holy crap, a lever. And I remember having to change a lever on those AMF machines, you know, with the big bar and the big thing going, bang, 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 taking the bar out and all that. So, you know, I hated it. But when I look back now and I hear Benji talking, that's why it touched me so much, because it brought so many memories. Because I'm not saying I come from the same school, because I was never in Cuba. And I didn't have, I was not around. I used to go to Cuba with Cynthia. Cynthia and I, we visited Cuba. We visited our aunts there. You know, my grandmother's family was there. My grandfather's family, they all were in Cuba. And, you know, they used to go back and forth. And I remember going Nochebuena and being in Bejucad. You know, I remember Ranchuelo. We were very close to the Trinidad family, to Estela Trinidad and Diego Trinidad. I mean, I'm talking about the old folks. And I remember going to the house because my cousin, I know that if Bernie's listening, Ernesto Perez Carillo, he would know my cousin, Orlando Garcia, my mother's first cousin, was a sales manager for Trinidad Hermano, for Trinidad. And we were in their house. I mean, it was all one family. And I remember all those days. So I don't have any experience with Cuban tobacco, although only what I remember seeing in the factory. But but my experience with Cuban tobacco more was people would bring me cigars when I was a teenager to try them, this and that. But I didn't have that much experience with working Cuban tobacco. Where I got most of my experience with Cuban tobacco was with Heller and Richard Meerapfel. And every time, you know, back to the early 80s when I was going to Paris to buy Cameroon, they used to take me to the warehouse because I was very interested. And they were the biggest importer of Cuban tobacco outside the United, you know, for Europe and other parts of the world. They used to blend cigars for different companies. They had a factory where they would do blends and so forth. So my experience mostly was with Richard Meerapfel and Heller, but mostly Richard. I wanted to learn everything I could about Cuban tobacco. It was my heritage. I wasn't able to go to Cuba. And I remember they had wrappers, they had medio tiempo. I mean, medio tiempo, man. I mean, real medio tiempo. I never forget that crop, that tobacco. It was old, and you open it up, and to me, it reminds me like some strong cheese, man. I'm telling you, I never forget that smell. And to make those cigars, and I used to make the strongest cigars I possibly could, because that's what I love. I love something that, and I just wanted to see, and it was just, everything is relative in life, Jose, if I may say now, because I feel bad. I'm talking a lot, and this is a professor show. This is not, you know, I'm just here to answer an occasional question, and you're supposed to support me. But
brother, let me tell you something. I mean, Jeremiah, we know he's very knowledgeable about tobacco, myself. But when it comes to Ybor City, I mean, the only thing really that I know, you guys, the Newmans, and I love to go to Colombia every time I go there and eat bacalao.
Well, no, Ybor City has a lot more bacalao. But going back to the Meerapfels, I used to like to get those strong cigars, and because I wanted to know, I was hungry for information. What did Cuba have that the rest of the world didn't have? Now, in those days, there was a huge difference. And that's one of the things that I remember. It was rich and powerful, and but this was very old tobacco was smoking too. This was medio tiempos, heavy ligeros that were 10 years old or so forth. I'm sure Jeremiah has heard the stories. And, I smoked that then. It's so different. And our cigars were mild. And cigars being made in Jamaica were mild. And cigars in Canary Islands were mild. And everything was mild. And the world, everything, if you look at the American market, it was dominated by two large companies, because there was only two large companies that could afford to advertise outside of what was called either Smoke Shop or Tobacconist Magazine, which were trade magazines, but it didn't go to the consumer. So the big companies, they, unlike us, that we don't have a marketing company, they have big marketing companies and everything, and people supporting. They go to malls, because back in the 70s and those days, the malls are where you bought your cigars. The Tinderbox, that was the most successful chain of cigars and everything. And they would do surveys in the malls. They would stop a lady. Tell me about a cigar. What do you like a cigar? The first thing they might say, the smell's offensive, or the aroma, not smell, but the aroma's offensive, and so forth. And everybody, they wanted mild. Remember, it was the days of Miller Lite, Marlboro Light, Bud Light, everything mild and light. And
I didn't know that's okay.
To finish my story, there was a difference. But then when we started making cigars in Nicaragua and everything, I saw that there was different tobaccos, this and that. And when I came to Dominican Republic, I realized that a lot of the tobaccos that were being sold was because by the packers and the farmers, was because that's what the market wanted. It wanted light. I worked at Pepe Mendez, Jose Mendez and Compañía. I worked there, or I lived in his home about 3 years in a row. Pepín Mendez, who we know and passed sadly, was one of my mentors in the early days in the 70s. And I remember all their ligeros and medio tiempos were there for years. I mean, they were not that easily sold. They had to really age them. They were very heavy. But the market, the big companies didn't want that, because the market didn't want that. So one thing that I learned, that I think with time, and when I started getting involved with Chateau de la Fuente and farming and so forth, that I had something in my memory that I wanted to recreate or bring it close to that, as far as body strength and everything. And with all the cigars that came after Fuente Opus X, Fuente Opus X was 92. All the cigars before that, they were all mild, basically, because nothing else heavy sold. I think the strongest cigars were made by Villazon. They were known for stronger cigars. But after Fuente Opus X comes out, and then we bring out VSGs and everything, I mean, the whole industry changed, the way they made cigars and everything. And now, I'm given a Cuban cigar and go to Cuba, not to Cuba, to Europe, and they give me a cigar. And I see the market is milder than the cigars that we're making in Central America or here in the Caribbean. A lot of cigars are not that strong. And, it just goes to show you how, one thing I learned is that, my opinion is that everything is relative. There was a huge difference in the past. Today, the difference is more individualistic of what you like. There's not that much difference in strength, not that much difference. The difference may come in construction and consistency and taste, different aromas and so forth. But it's really, the whole industry has developed so much outside of Cuba that it's just incredible. And one thing that I learned that, sadly, for someone to prosper, others have to suffer. And if it wasn't for, I've said these words before, I'll say it again. I shouldn't say it. but I'm going to say it because I have a lot of friends who lost family and firing squads and things like that. But it wasn't for the devil himself, Fidel Castro. There wouldn't be a cigar industry in the Dominican Republic. There wouldn't be a prosperous cigar industry in Nicaragua. Cancun wouldn't be full of tourists. Las Vegas wouldn't be what it is today. And, you know, all the people left and they went and they built somewhere else. And it's very, very sad that after 60 years, that the people of Cuba still, you know, don't have freedoms and so forth. And, you know, I shouldn't get involved with this because I've never lived there. But I've had a lot of friends and everything who have shared their life with me, and it breaks my heart. But going back to cigars, the difference is not that huge anymore. Of course, Cuba has been in making cigars for 200 years. They were the only ones, unless it was Tampa. And Tampa were known as clear Havana cigars. And this is information about Ybor City. I have boxes here. You can see it. It says Arturo Fuente, Clear Havana. Clear Havana was a destination given by the U.S. Customs to Tampa factories. Every factory who used 100% Havana tobacco had to have a customs official in the factory who opened and closed the door. The tobacco was brought in from Cuba duty-free. And taxes were not paid on the import of the tobacco, but taxes were paid on cigars when they were made. And it was a U.S. made product, even though it was clear Havana tobacco. That is the reason why Cuba could not compete at prices, because Cuba had very high tariffs with the United States after the sinking of the Maine and everything. They put a lot of tariffs and so forth, and it caused the industry to move to Tampa. And you used to buy cigars. There were Havana cigars made by Cubans with the best Cuban tobacco made in Tampa. So, I mean, that's part of the history and everything that goes along with it.
Definitely.
It's good that everybody has heard this. I think it's history. One of the things that we do here is tell a lot of people about the good times, the bad times, the ugly times. What you said about Cuba is the truth. We don't have to get into it, but it did hurt a lot of families, and you hit it right on the nose. If it would have been for him, who knows how small Nicaragua, Dominican Republic, Jamaica, and other countries would have been. Honduras also.
No, there's no question. And when you talk about families, you talk about families who, you know, had all their properties confiscated, families who were in generations in Cuba. Like I said, Cuba had 200 years of cigar making heritage and history. The Dominican Republic has possibly 40. 200 years of dominating. It gives them a lot of leverage and everything. But think about what they've accomplished in 200 years and what the Dominican Republic, Nicaragua, and so forth have accomplished in 40 something years. But when you talk about families, you have families like the Roas, Plasencias, Bermejos. Of course, you can't be without mentioning Oliva, the Paris, all these families and many more, they left Cuba into areas that were primitive, basically speaking. And they were pioneers, with a machete and knives and having to cut the ways through roadways and everything, or way to get into certain areas, looking for land that, tobacco's never been grown. I've heard the stories from all these gentlemen, these older gentlemen and everything are gone, but I heard the stories of them having to cross rivers and things to get to places, and what they went through and all that to build today to a world where you have outside of Cuba, where you talk about 350 or so people 1,000 people who are employed or that depend directly on the cigar industry. Listen, I have nothing against Cuba. There's some beautiful, beautiful people in Cuba, and they grow great tobacco. I know families there. I have friends there. Hirochi's I have the greatest respect for him, what he's doing, following his grandfather's footsteps. His grandfather was amazing. He was, he was one of those guys. I used to speak to him I spoke to him on the phone a couple of times. I used to send them humidor bags with visitors that used to come that were going there so he could put his cigars in. But when I spoke to him, even though it was two different worlds, when I spoke to him from the Dominican Republic, I heard a voice that reminded me of my grandfather. It sounded just the same. And, you know, I really feel for the people of Cuba and the farmers and everything in the old school, because it's, you know, they work hard and they have the talent and everything. It just economically, they sometimes don't have the support that they need. But hopefully one day that they will, and hopefully one day they'll be able to, you know, have the support and make the products that they did at one time. And nothing that would make me happier than to be able to compete on a level playing field. You know, much like when we're doing in Europe now, we're new, people don't know who we are. They didn't even know we exist. They didn't even know cigars were made outside of Cuba. People slowly are learning. And I'm looking forward to the day that maybe one day the United States, you know, will have an opportunity, and I'll have an opportunity to be able to compete one-on-one. And, you know, Cuba may be the New York Yankees, I don't know, but I'll be Pedro Martinez for the Boston Red Sox, and my first pitch is going right at the batter's head. So, you know, I just think that, you know, politics is not, it's just sad. And you know, you say we're going to talk about Cuba and Tampa. I can't say much about Cuba, but that I haven't met a Cuban that, you know, that left Cuba, and I don't hear their voice, their accent and everything, that I don't feel I'm one of theirs. That's something that we have in our blood, and I just wish for their freedom. But meantime, we're here in the Dominican Republic. We're all in Nicaragua. We're Honduras. We got great Cuban families. I remember Richard Meerapfel saying, and Jeremiah remember this. I said, Richard, don't say that. It's embarrassing, because it was a long time ago. And I don't think we were at the position that we are today, or the Padrones, for example. Today, I mean, the Padrones are respected worldwide. They're Cuban. And I remember Richard Meerapfel used to say, whenever we had an event in Paris or London or something in front of very prestigious, respectable people, he says, I remember the first time I heard him saying, I was like floored. He says, I still believe the best cigars are made by Cubans. And I heard that, and I go, oh. He says, but they're made by Cubans outside of Cuba. And he started mentioning the Cuban families and things like this. And, you know, I really feel uncomfortable, to say the least, when we're compared. You know, when I'm compared, or somebody's compared to my colleagues in Nicaragua or Honduras. I lived in the Iroa house. I know Christian Iroa when he was learning to walk. I used to live in his father's house. I spent a lot of time there with his father. After we lost our factory in Nicaragua, I was in Esteli. And I know these people, and besides, you know, we're all competitors and everything. We're all trying to make a living, and we're all proud of our products. But I don't like to be compared to Cuba or Nicaragua. When I say I mean the Fuente family, their company. That's why I just said, man, I just want to be able to stand on our own, make the best products humanly possible, pay tribute to my heritage, my grandfather, grandmother, everybody who worked in that little wooden house, all the years of my father, which it would take 10 lifetimes to say all the sacrifices that he went through. That are, you know, it is not normal, and I don't think it's human. And to see everything he's gone through, and the love he gave everyone, to me, that's why I've always believed, you know, I just wish that I'm able to come through and not let anyone down, just to give the best products humanly possible. And I know that I see my sister, Cynthia. There's no one who has the passion that she has. She loves all the people. She's still the same little girl. They used to sit in the cigar maker's lap in Tampa. regardless of what her age is. And I see my daughter Liana, you know, the same way, with a passion and with a love for cigars. But more than cigars is the love for people. And that is why I just wish our industry, we could just, you know, all be closer, and we could relive those days when everybody, no matter how hard we fought, we all respect each other. We know we have to fight hard, but we respected each other. I know the old days of Tampa, Ybor City, the big companies, you know, Manuel Garcia Vega, the owners of Perfecto Garcia, you know, La Nessa, Stanford Newman, all of them, Morgan, Tommy Morgan. Everybody used to go to the same restaurant, and a lot of times end up eating on the same table and talk about family and everything. Yet they were vicious competitors. You know, I miss those days. I miss those days sincerely, and I just wish that, you know, they come back. But in the meantime, I have a responsibility to do the best I can, and hopefully our family will follow the same footsteps that my father and grandfather has guided us through, and we could provide great cigars for many, many decades to come.
Ladies and gentlemen,
Jeremiah?
well, I'm speechless, of course. This is another testimony and tribute to both what the industry should be like and what the Fuente family represent and the values they represent. Jose, I'm sorry, but Carlito took the spotlight away from you, and I'm very glad he did. I think everybody today learned a great deal, not only about cigars, but about what's behind them and the people that are behind them and the stories that are behind them. And I think we've been blessed for Carlito to have such time today to show us what's behind the scenes and what makes up all the little elements that have created Fuente the way Fuente is today. So Carlito, thank you very, very, very much. It was humbling to listen to you today.
To be honest,
you,
you and I are talking, we talked in the morning early, and I said, this idea just came to me talking with Benji, and I mean, him telling me, you know, the amount of cigars that were made in Cuba was made in Tampa. I had an idea about what it was, and you and I talked about it, but I wanted today to be like Carlito's day for what means for the Fuente family and for all the Spaniards and the Cubans who came to Tampa to make Tampa the cigar capital of the world. So you heard it from Carlito, and I mean, who better to really expose and give us a lecture? And as we always say at Fuente Meerapfel, Meet the Professor, it's all about love, it's all about history, but it's history in the making.
It absolutely is.
Absolutely.
It is.
We still have a lot of history to make, and I plan to be around for a couple of more decades and make sure that that it's a big impact. So we still have a lot more, because people deserve the best, and nothing is more rewarding than know that you could bring a smile to someone's face.
True. Yes.
Well, we're counting on that. And Carlito, keep leading the way, keep paving the road into the future. And let's make sure that this industry goes exactly where you want it to go, and where the other cigar lovers and cigar aficionados and all the other passionate people out there can access something very, very magic, which is the beauty of this cigar industry. Ladies and gentlemen, before we go today, we're going to lighten up this show with a little humor from our friend Benoit on Benoit's Baked. Benoit, are you with us?
Yes, I'm there. Hello, everybody.
I've been
Hello, Benoit.
Hey, Benoit.
Hello. So, a woman goes to the gynecologist. Gynecologist?
Gynecologist, yes.
Gynecologist, yes.
Okay, this
So
is,
the doctor
this
is
is hold on a second, Benoit. This is another one of these days where we have to ask anybody under 21 to hang up and remind you that we're broadcasting out of Switzerland.
Thank you.
Back to your gynecologist.
The gynecologist, so the doctor examine the woman and say, wow, oh my God, what a hole. So the woman got furious. She gets dressed, slap the doctor, and then the next day she makes another appointment with another gynecologist. So she go to the rendezvous. The doctor examine the woman and say, "Wow, my goodness, it's amazing. I never seen this before." So the woman gets dressed, slap the doctor. She's very, very angry and goes home. So she doesn't understand what happened. So she goes to her room. She places a mirror on the ground. Then she put herself on the mirror and she spreads the legs to see what happened. And then suddenly the husband come in the room and said, "Darling, what are you doing? Watch out, you will fall into the hole." That's it.
Oh my God. Oh my God. Oh my God. I didn't hear that.
Oh my goodness.
I didn't hear that. No.
All right. On that note, this is going from bad to worse. On that note, it's that time of the day. Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Carlito. Thank you, Professor. Thank you, Benoit. Melanie, thank you very much for making all of these special. It's another episode concluded of Fuente and Meerapfel present Meet the Professor. We are looking forward to seeing all of you on Friday. Friday is a very big day. I think Melanie.
Share with your friends. Share, tell everybody to join us. It's going to be amazing.
It's going to be a very, very big show. We have the Newmans on Friday. The Newmans guest of honor on Friday. So make sure to spread the news. It's going to be a hell of a show. Until then, please be safe. Take care of yourselves and of others. Goodbye for now.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.
Much love. God bless you all.
Bye.